think we should start. Hadia, do you want to introduce the speakers? Okay, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is the panel on addressing external vulnerabilities in South Asian countries. So we have eminent experts here with us today, and we're going to talk about the sources of vulnerability in South Asian countries. And our focus is particularly going to be on macroeconomic challenges and current account deficits. I think all of the countries which are here in the panel today have had some balance of payment crises. And so we talk about the experiences of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, as well as their respective responses to these challenges. So I'll take a couple of minutes to introduce the panelists. I'm Hadia Majid. I am the chair of economics here at LUMS and an associate professor of economics as well. I'm joined by, so I'm going to start with my right, with Dr. Ahmad Hassan. Dr. Ahmad Ahsan. He is the director of the Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh and currently researching Bangladesh's economic geography, recent economic developments, and East Asian development experience lessons. He's previously been the lead economist in East Asia and Pacific region in the World Bank and has more than 20 years of experience in leading policy dialogues with governments. Welcome, Dr. Ahmad. Joining us online are Dr. Deepak Mishra. Dr. Deepak is the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. And prior to joining ICRIA, he was the practice manager at the World Bank's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice, responsible for East Asia and Pacific regions. He has held various positions at the bank. He's been the country economist for Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, and Vietnam. Welcome, Dr. Deepak. Also with us online today is Dr. Shantayanan Devarajan. I pronounced that okay?
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Shantayanan is a professor of the practice of international development at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Prior to Georgetown, he spent 28 years at the World Bank and he was Senior Director for Development Economics, the Chief Economist of South Asia, Africa, Middle East, and North Africa regions. Welcome, Dr. Shantayanan. And then we have Dr. Murtaza Syed, who is the head of ecosystem at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. He has more than 25 years of experience in macroeconomic research and policy making. He was previously deputy governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, as well as acting governor during 2022. Welcome, Dr. Murtaza. Dr. Ijaz Nabi is the final panelist. He is country director and senior advisor for Jordan and Lebanon, and he's country director Pakistan at the International Growth Center, hosted jointly by the London School of Economics and Oxford University. He's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, Washington, D.C., and is a member of Pakistan Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He chairs the boards of the Punjab Population Innovation Fund, the PSTF, as well as PPAF. Welcome, Dr. Ijaz Nabi. So that's all our panelists. We have a very interesting session planned. As I've said, we're going to be talking about the key themes of discussion today are going to be vulnerabilities in South Asia, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the macro angle. And we talk about not just the sources of vulnerability, but also what are potential ways forward to reduce these vulnerabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Hadia. I think the CV needs to be updated. As you get older, you shed many things. So I think some of these things I no longer do. So Shanta and I wrote a paper together in 2006. It was about economic growth in South Asia. And it was subtitled Promising, Unequalizing, Sustainable. Now, in 2006 or 5...
There was a question mark.
There was a question
mark. Remember.
Yes, there was a question mark. And now in 2005-6, I guess the data was maybe up to 2004. It was very difficult to tell how the growth experience in these countries would pan out going forward. So we made our best educated guesses based on our knowledge of what was happening in South Asia, what the respective strengths were. We discussed those strengths and weaknesses. And today, almost 18 years since then, we are able to see the ground reality as it has transpired. We can see that India more than fulfilled its promise in 2005-6. Some of the issues about inequality that we mentioned, they're still there. There must be nagging economists who are observing the Indian economy, and we'll see what Deepak has to say about it. Pakistan's growth, the question mark was a big one, because we could see that it is very consumption-oriented growth. And whether that would be sustainable or not was a question that we raised. Sri Lanka we didn't predict Sri Lanka's problems that eventually transpired. So I'm Bangladesh. Similarly, it was the trend, the socioeconomic, the social trends were very good. We couldn't say that the economic growth would be sustained the way it was sustained in Bangladesh. So today, let's start with we had an order because of some people are here in person and some people are with us virtually. We had an order, Emun. So Shanta, we are going to ask you to tell us why Sri Lanka diverged so much from what we had expected back in the 2005-6, and why did Sri Lanka's external vulnerabilities became so strong that it landed in the balance of payments crisis that it faced a couple of years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be with old friends again and discuss what is perhaps the most important issue in South Asia today. I think I have a very simple answer, but then I'm going to have to elaborate a bit, that Sri Lanka's external vulnerabilities are all due to internal politics. Sri Lanka, as most of you know, suffered a major debt crisis in 2022, where they had to default on their external debt. This was accompanied by a collapse of the economy. The GDP fell by 7%, and then the following year fell by another 3%. Inflation hit 70%, 70. The country ran out of foreign reserves, which is why they had to default, but also that meant they ran out of imports. So there were shortages of fuel, food, medicines, and the democratically elected President Rajapaksa was thrown out of office following a major protest. Now, remember, this was 2022 when the global economy was reeling from the effects of COVID, as well as the Ukraine war that had just got started. So there were huge external pressures on the economy. But what is very clear is that this default and the crisis was entirely due to the Sri Lankan policymakers. Because back in 2019, 3 years earlier, the Rajapaksa government, the newly elected government, they cut taxes, and the tax to GDP ratio went to 8%, which is one of the lowest in the world. And immediately, by March of 2020, the credit rating agencies had downgraded Sri Lanka to near default levels. This was before COVID had actually taken effect. So this was purely due to the fiscal deficit, which had ballooned to about 13% of GDP. Now, what most countries do in that situation is to try to restructure the debt because you can't borrow to refinance, and the other is to embark on an IMF program. And the Sri Lankan government refused to do both for 2.5 years, despite advice from various economists inside and outside the country. They steadfastly refused an IMF to do an IMF program and refused to restructure the debt. What that meant was they had to pay back the creditors out of reserves. And so, not surprisingly, reserves fell to zero in 2 years. Secondly, they financed this fiscal deficit of 13% of GDP by borrowing from the central bank. And as the textbooks will tell you, or the textbooks that we all learn from, there are some new ones that go off on some other tangents. The textbook will tell you that creates inflation. And not, as textbooks predicted, inflation hit 70%. So this external shock or the shock and the collapse of the economy was entirely homegrown. Now, what I want to add, and I'm going to make a comment about Bangladesh. I know that Ahmed is there, and he may not agree, but I think what was really going on. I mean, you try to ask the question: why did Sri Lanka delay for 2.5 years without an IMF program and without a debt restructuring? And I suffered through this and tried to understand better. And I think there is something else that seems to be common among our South Asian countries. And this goes back to that paper that Ijaz and I did 16 years ago, 18 years ago, which is that when countries have been doing reasonably well, which was the case in Sri Lanka for the last 30 years, and Bangladesh, as Ijaz mentioned, there's a sense of denial that you have a real underlying problem. And that, I think, was exactly what was going on in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has managed to maintain 3% per capita GDP growth, 3% plus, over a 30-year period, including during a 26-year civil war. So there's a sense that Sri Lanka will always come out of these crises. They had tsunamis and civil wars and terrorist attacks and everything else, and they somehow bounced back. And the policymakers seem to think, yeah, this is just another one of those exogenous shocks. We'll get through it. And that was the denial that they really had a serious problem that they needed to fix if they wanted to avoid a calamity. And they refused to do that. And so my view is of Bangladesh is that this is the same thing. And I confess that I'm probably responsible for part of that too, because I was constantly touting Bangladesh's great successes, both in terms of human development, in terms of education and health indicators, which are better than India's, as well as its growth performance, which has been steady and rising growth, even though it was one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and governance was deeply rooted in the country, bad governance, and still, so there was still that same sense of denial that, hey, they're showing results, so maybe this governance isn't a problem. This is what I call the Bangladesh paradox. But I think we missed, and when I say we, the whole international community, but also the policymakers in the country, missed the fact that these deeply rooted problems actually eat into the psyche of the population. And what you found in Bangladesh was that the students in particular and the young people really deeply resented this misgovernance. And eventually it got to a point where the whole thing blew up. And again, Sheikh Hasina had to lead the country amid widespread protests. So to summarize, I think the external vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka's case, and I will guess in Bangladesh's case, were entirely homegrown. We let ourselves be vulnerable by neglecting the deep underlying pathologies in our governance, and that has just come back to haunt us at this point.
Thank you, Shanta. I think you've identified the principal source of vulnerability quite correctly as internal, because we'll see this thread in all of the countries. I mean, some countries in South Asia, India in particular, looks fantastic. When you just look at the reserves and the number of months of imports India has accumulated in over $600 billion dollars worth of imports. So in some sense, India doesn't face the kind of vulnerability that Pakistan faces, or Sri Lanka faces, or Bangladesh faces. But at the same time, the internal factors, which very quickly eat away into reserves, those internal factors, it'll be very interesting to see whether India has brought those factors under control as well. But before I turn to Deepak for his views in India, let's hear it from Ahmad, whether he agrees or disagrees with Shanta.
Actually, I agree very profoundly with Shanta. And in one of my recent writings after the change, I compared the Bangladesh economy as it was in the last 10 years, I would say, to the Titanic economy, that outwardly above the decks, everything was very glitzy. There were a lot of remittances, foreign exchange coming in, a lot of imports coming in, a lot of wealthy people, luxury apartments, and governments very complacent. But beneath the water level, there were several punctures. Punctures like the financial sector was actually basically in tatters. Balance sheets were extremely distressed. The other major factor in human development, although we had expanded largely our education system, health system, but the quality was very poor. And as a result, where skills were concerned, something like between 50 to 100,000 expatriate workers were working in Bangladesh. So you had number of fundamental problems underneath the water level, and sooner or later we would come to a crash. But you couldn't say these things earlier. So you had to be we were all writing about these things, but we had to be all very circumspect about how we wrote about it. But that changed. So one thing I will defer with Shanta is that in the case of Bangladesh, it was an undemocratically elected Hasina who had to leave the country, not a democratically elected Hasina. And it actually, the issue is serious. The problems of Bangladesh are closely tied to the fact that the last 3 elections were basically rigged. And as a result, the more the government lost its legitimacy, the more, and it thought it could rule by its bayonets, the more reckless it became with overall governance and management. And corruption, which at one time with the World Bank, I thought we made too much of a fuss about because it's essentially petty. But the last 10 years, corruption went wild, wild west. Grand scale corruption. It's unthinkable every day. When I hear news about the bank balance sheets, you hear about the power contracts. We owe Adani $500 million even before we have the first megawatt of power coming in from there, and so on. So a lot of bad contracts, deals have been made, all with deliberate purpose of in exchange for money. So I don't know how far you want me to go. So I am agreeing completely with what, and very much so, that even though the government tried to say that this was a terms of trade shock, and it was, our import bill went up by something like $24 billion in the fiscal year 2022. And we lost about the equivalent amount in reserves in the last 2-3 years. But why did this happen? The vulnerabilities were growing in the last 8 to 10 years.
Thank you, Ahmed. Now, Deepak knows Pakistan much better than many Pakistanis know. He used to work on Pakistan when he was at the World Bank, and he has traveled extensively. One of the best economic reports written on Pakistan was the economic report on Sindh, which Deepak led. and he used to travel in trucks to go and see the lay of the land. Unfortunately, Deepak, the distance between Delhi and Lahore is maybe 250 miles, but the geopolitical distance is infinite. Therefore, we don't have you here with us enjoying the dinner and the rooftop restaurants that Shanta misses so much. So Deepak, India has it gone past its vulnerabilities? When I compared last Pakistani and Indian fiscal deficit, I said, my God, Indian fiscal deficit is often higher than Pakistan's fiscal deficit. Why is it that India doesn't get into the same balance of payments problem as we do? And then I looked at the respective savings rate and I began to understand why. India's savings rate is twice ours. And India continues to invest. The public investment programs remains robust, whereas ours has completely crashed. So there are some superficial explanations of why India isn't vulnerable. But Deepak, I'm sure you will unearth things that my superficial look at the data didn't show up.
Thank you, Ijaz. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for saying that I know a little bit about Pakistan economy. That's a good compliment to have. I wish I could have been there. It's a huge loss for me. There's a lot to discuss, so I'll be very quick. I had a presentation, but perhaps I'll bring it in at some point during the discussion. But just when I'm listening to both Shanta and Ahmad, it feels like, we have passed through that phase around 2012, 2013, when India was part of the fragile five economies. There was massive balance of payment issues. I mean, massive in the sense that rupee had appreciated, came under pressure. There's huge banking sector issue, non-banking sector is also exploded after a few years. So a lot of the similar macroeconomic problems that we are describing today, and it's just not Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, the three other countries here, but it's also happening in Maldives and Nepal and many other parts of South Asia country. I think India had gone through it, and it was looking at hindsight, it looks like a very fortuitous thing that India did work very hard to fix those problems. So if I have to say, a lot of it is hard work, perspiration rather than inspiration. There's not a big magic bullet that explains why India is doing it. But if you go through, and the slide I had is, so first thing, just want to say that, if you look at inflation, if you look at fiscal deficit, if you look at current account deficit, it's almost like a different regime now than we had, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years ago. So there's been a fundamental shift in the way the macro and the external indicators and behavior have changed. And I credit it to three things. One is there's a fundamental shift in the attitude among policymakers about macroeconomic stability. They're all inflation hawk. And you'll be surprised, and partly because inflation is a big deal in India. People lose power, politicians lose power, and elections are fought on elections. So on inflation, so inflation is a big deal. And the current administration is actually way more, invested and committed to macro stability than any past leadership were for the long time. So I think that's a big deal. In terms of institutional reform, there is a number of things that the Indians have done over the last few years, which I think is bearing fruits. The first is, what is called the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act. That was passed long time ago in 2005, but Indians have always tried to adhere to it when they get out of the range, which is, it sets basically fiscal deficit 3% and debt at 60%. Almost every year, they might have been higher, but the finance minister during budget time will apologetically say that they are outside it and give a path to how do they come back to that rate. Now there's a bit of a discussion that is 3% too low, should they go to 4%? But they did review the Fiscal Responsible Budget Management Act a few years ago, and they recommitted themselves to the similar target, saying that the deficit should be as much that it reduces debt to bring it to 60% level. So there's a big commitment on the fiscal side, though the outcomes do not match the commitment on that. But on the monetary and the exchange rate side, so first thing is India adopted a flexible inflation targeting in 2016. They set up a whole set of institutional mechanism for monetary policy committee and other things, which have really been important. India introduced an asset quality review of all the banks. And it was done in 2015. That really led to identification of massive non-performing loans in the banks. So it went up all the way to 11% of GDP of the bank assets, and those have come down over time. Now they're in 2 to 3 percentage points. So that the asset quality review was a big factor. There was a bankruptcy code that was done so that when the banks have default, those companies will go through the bankruptcy code, and that also has been very fundamental shift in this policy. Then the other thing that India, I think, did well was during COVID, when everybody was stimulating a lot. I think India also had to, but because either the dates were already high and the fiscal deficit were high, India did not have a lot of room, but the policymakers would say that they choose not to stimulate. So I don't know how was it, that they didn't have the scope, or they decided not to stimulate the economy, and whatever money went for the post-COVID, it was to deal with the supply side of the economy, not so much to increase the demand. And India has always been a supply-constrained economy, and that's why the inflation used to be so high. So during the COVID and the post-COVID period, a lot of the supply-side constraints have been relaxed. So the infrastructure has been built, the logistics have improved, and that actually is bearing fruits in the last few years in terms of higher growth and better competitiveness. So I just wanted to end up with some of those positive things, though there are lots of other issues in terms of structural issues that India needs to do well, but the commitment on the macro is at this point pretty unquestionable.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We also have a Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was passed by the Parliament. We have never, ever met its requirements. In fact, I remember I used to work on Thailand during the Thai financial crisis of the late 1990s. And we were trying to get the finance minister of Thailand to start spending money. We said, look, the economy desperately needs a fiscal stimulus. So if the government were to run up a deficit, this would be the right thing to do. And he was adamant. He said, there is no way my parliament will allow me to run a fiscal deficit. It's just not allowed. So I said, look, I think you guys need some technical assistance. I'm going to get people from Pakistan to come and tell you how to run up a fiscal deficit. We had a great laugh at that. But Murtaza, tell me, we remain highly vulnerable because of the debt that we run up, the debt servicing we need to do. Of course, the causes map back into the way the economy is being managed. But let's hear your version of things.
Thank you very much, Ijaz Sahab, and it's a real pleasure to be on this panel. As Hadia said, my last job in Pakistan was in the central bank, and I still have some PTSD from that experience, because the last year of that tenure was one in which Pakistan came perilously close to defaulting, and there was a lot of political instability, which led to paralysis on the economic front, which took us down a path that I hope we will not go down again. But the reality of Pakistan is, and I mean, my remarks are going to be tinged with some sadness, because I'm thinking today about, when I first started working on Pakistan, which was about 30 years ago, and my old friend Adil Malik from Oxford is also here. We worked together for someone called Mehboob Haq, who was a former finance minister of Pakistan and a very visionary economic thinker who made his name on the global stage, advocating for the global south. Absolutely, absolutely. And whenever I see Mehboob Haq Saab's name associated with the center, it always brings back a lot of good memories. So at that time, when I had begun working on Pakistan, there was a lot of hope around Pakistan's trajectory. And I think the paper that you perhaps wrote with Shanta in 2005-06 maybe had some of that optimism also in it. It was a time when we were told that, Pakistan's trajectory was probably going to be better than its peers, both in terms of social indicators, but also economic growth. But if you look back now, unfortunately, we've had what I would argue to be basically 3 lost decades. And three lost decades in which, while we have made some improvements in economic indicators, we've really fallen behind the rest of the region, and certainly fallen behind the high-performing economies of Asia. And I think we should also benchmark ourselves against those economies, not just the economies in our region. The problem, I think, in Pakistan is that we are an economy that is almost destined to have a balance of payments crisis, because our problems are not so much to do with shocks that hit us every now and again. Basically, our problems stem from our growth model itself. It's a growth model that doesn't fit at all well for a developing country that needs fast growth. It doesn't fit at all well with the kind of economic model that we know was responsible for the amazing growth stories that we've seen in Asia. It's basically an economic growth model that does almost everything wrong. We know from the East Asian experience that you need an economy that is built on exports. You need an economy that is built on investment. You need an economy that has macro stability. You need an economy which is run by capable technocrats and a very committed political leadership with vision for where it wants to take the country. Unfortunately, I would argue that Pakistan has had very little, if anything, of that in the last 3 decades, maybe even going back further. Pakistan is also a country where we have to run to the IMF almost every 2 years. We've had to go to the IMF 25 times in our history, almost, I think, 16 times since the early 1990s. So an average of once every 2 years. And it's not because of an accident. This is the thought that I want to, I think, really instill. It is an artifact of the way that we grow. Our growth model is highly, highly dependent on consumption. I was shocked when I came to Pakistan to learn that Pakistan's consumption to GDP ratio is 95%. I thought the US, which I was coming from, was a consumption-oriented economy, but 95% of GDP is a ratio that I think, just is it's no wonder that we run into continual problems. What comes with that consumption is also a dependence on imports, obviously, to fuel that consumption. And at the same time, our economy does not invest at all. We've been stuck at an investment to GDP ratio of about 15% for almost 30 years now. We've never really seen a spurt in our investment. You have to go back a long way, perhaps in the 60s when we had some big infrastructure projects that were happening in Pakistan. Otherwise, 15% of GDP. The literature tells you that if you want to be a fast-growing economy and you want to manage your external vulnerabilities, you have to found your economic growth on investment, on savings, on exports, and on linking yourself with the rest of the world. We've been able to do none of those things in the last 30 years, maybe even longer. So it's not an accident that we go to the IMF 25 times in our history. The external vulnerabilities of Pakistan are not a bug of our economic model. They're almost a feature. It's invariable that we will have to go to the IMF. We don't have the capability of sustaining this growth model. I will also say that if you look at Pakistan's average current account deficits, and current account deficits are one indicator of external vulnerability. If those get too large, you typically start to run out of reserves. Pakistan's average current account deficits are not actually that big. It's only those boom-bust cycles that we have to be careful about. When our current account deficits go above 3-4% of GDP, that's when we tend to get into trouble. But on average, we run a current account deficit of about 2% of GDP. But there are two problems with that, in addition to the boom and bust. One is that the reason why we're running the current account deficit is not because we're investing a lot. The current account deficit is just basically the difference between the savings and investment in your economy. You could be running a current account deficit if you were investing a lot. I told you we're not doing that. We're consuming a lot. The reason why we have a current account deficit is because we live beyond our means. We try to consume at pretending to be a country that is at a much higher level of income than we are. That's one issue. The other issue is how we fund the current account deficit. Other countries run much bigger current account deficits, but they don't rely on government borrowing to fund that current account deficit. In Pakistan, we've become a one-trick pony. The only way we can sustain our current account deficits is by having the government go out and keep borrowing. And so what has happened in the last 15 years is that in addition to our current account vulnerabilities, we have now also got a debt problem. A debt problem that has become very difficult for us to service, and a debt problem that has begun to crowd out development spending, climate change related spending that Pakistan needs, and most importantly, public investment is being crowded out by this very high debt burden that we carry. So I will say, Ijaz Saab, that unfortunately, I think for Pakistan to address its external vulnerabilities requires a wholesale reform in the way that the economy is run. But I think we can also draw inspiration, as Deepak was saying, from what India did in the 1990s. When they went to the IMF and they found it to be a very, very demeaning experience, and they resolved not to go to the IMF again, like we have resolved on many, many occasions, but they actually meant it. And they did some reforms that I think have put India on a much stronger front in terms of its external vulnerabilities. So I think there is hope, but it will require very, very hard-nosed reforms.
Thank you. In our next round, just picking up the conversation from where we've reached now, we want to talk a little bit about, the growth models. And Murtaza quite rightly said that countries that have done on a sustained basis, East Asian economies, have all done well on the back of strong exports. Because that has allowed them to bring in the imports that they needed for the investments they needed to do to have the growth cycle going. Bangladesh has had some success in exports, but only in one sector. Bangladesh has tried very hard, but still, you don't get the diverse base of exports that you would need. India's services exports, yes. IT exports, yes. But beyond that, we'd like to hear from Deepak why it's been hard for India, for example, to be as competitive in balance of trade as China is, for example. And similarly, it'd be good to hear from Shanta whether Sri Lanka, which was in some sense, given the education levels, etc., of the workers, was best positioned to have the East Asia type export-led growth strategy. Why did it not happen in Sri Lanka? Shanta, starting from you.
Okay, thanks. Well, in one sense, Ijaz, Sri Lanka did follow an East Asian model starting back in the late 1970s. I mean, they liberalized trade in the late 1970s amid a lot of concern that this would lead to the collapse of some of the protected industries and so on. And instead, the place just boomed. And Sri Lanka actually had a garment industry along the Bangladesh lines. And in fact, per capita exports of garments were higher in Sri Lanka than Bangladesh, going through the late 1990s. So Sri Lanka is almost a textbook case of how trade liberalization actually works. And as you said, the highly educated population enabled them to benefit from that. And it, employed millions of workers in the garment industry and other industries in Sri Lanka during that period. Now, what has happened in the last 15 years, or almost 20 years now, is that they have been slowly increasing trade restrictions and introducing non-tariff barriers and huge problems with trade logistics. So that the trade ratio, the exports plus imports divided by GDP, has fallen from about 44% to 20%. During this last 15 years. And not surprisingly, growth has slowed down. So Sri Lanka, I think, has not been able to take advantage of growth of the trade liberalization because they haven't been practicing trade liberalization in the last 10 to 15 years. And now we've seen the consequences of that.
Ahmad?
I'm happy to speak. Actually, you asked Deepak first.
Okay, so Deepak, by consensus, we want to hear you first.
Okay. I think a few things. I think India, while India has been growing around 6 to 6.5 on average for the last 30 years. In fact, 40 years if you all the way from late 80s, but mostly from 1991 after the crisis till 2024. The growth model is not as good or as we described as Murtaza was describing for East Asian countries. India still remains perpetually in current account deficit. But it does a little bit better than its neighbors for us, but it's obviously nowhere close to the East Asia tigers or the China. But I think there are a couple of interesting stories on India that makes it stand apart. So first thing is, so today there was a big article on every newspaper saying for the first time in India, export of services have exceeded export of manufacturing. So this is kind of pretty big deal that exports normally, when we are growing up as students, exports are still an untradable sector. Most of the things are consumed at home. And thanks to all the digital and IT revolution, a large part of exports are now tradable. And India has actually done pretty well on services, though the current increase in services exceeding manufacturing largely because the manufacturing export is slumping, not because services is going gangbuster. It's growing at a 20-25%, but the manufacturing is doing pretty badly. So service, and we know the story that, so the thing is, what are the policy implications of this? So there's an IT minister in India who once said that not because of, but in spite of government support, the ITs have boomed. So in a sense, it was, if the government knew that this is a sector that was doing well, they could have actually hobbled it through the regulation and kind of killed the sector. So thankfully, they didn't know that this is a sector which is, growing so well. And then by the time it became pretty obvious, then the government took interest and made it possible. But there's not a huge amount of government support that is going to services, which is kind of funny. It is with Prime Minister Modi, there's a huge amount of focus on manufacturing. And here, the story is that India still doesn't have the same kind of manufacturing bandwidth as East Asian countries, but they're starting to have incremental gains. And those are being made a big deal that, we are now suddenly becoming manufacturing powerhouse, but there are certainly important gains. So nearly 20% of the Apple phones are now made in India. They are at the lower end of the spectrum, but nevertheless, it's important. There are a couple of more electronic manufacturing, chips manufacturing starting to come in, but it is using a bunch of heterodox policies to get there. And we can talk about it, both trade protectionism and domestic incentives. And, with all this whole industrial revolution up in circulation now by rich countries, India does get a pass by pursuing some of the policies which 10, 20 years ago, most people or most economies would not recommend to the countries. But I think I wanted to say that there's another thing that's happening. And this is more personal. Modi was the chief minister of a state, which is Gujarat, which has a 40% industry to GDP ratio. So it's one of the most industrialized and one of the most export intensive sector in India. And so he doesn't understand why other states can't do so well as Gujarat is. And not being an economist and not being exposed to all the doctrines of economists has helped. So he hasn't told by Danny Roderick that there's a premature deindustrialization that's happening in the rest of the world. He hasn't heard the stuff that the manufacturing bus has left and you can't get a seat anymore. So he's pretty determined to get ahead and create a manufacturing base in many parts of India. And he's getting incremental success, and obviously those being kind of made amplified to say it's there, but there is nevertheless success happening on the ground. And how is it coming through? As I said, partly trade protection, not massive trade protection, but certainly increasing the custom duties to some level, 3 to 5 to 7 percentage point, to kind of force, and then a lot of non-tariff barriers to force these companies to say, come and make in India. And export to the rest of the world, but do not just bring in stuff assembled from the rest of the world. And obviously, history will be written on whether this is the right way to do it. The second is there's a production-link incentive scheme that was created, which is basically to encourage manufacturing firms to produce more at home, and the incentive is linked to how much you produce. Indians obviously wanted to do it export-link incentive, but that will be shot down by WTO, because you can't link your incentive to amount of export. So it was changed to production link incentives. And some people would credit the PLI as an important reason why a lot of manufacturing firms are coming in, though equally large number of trade economists like me would disagree with the actually because there's not been a real impact analysis of those things. But there are lots of interesting experimentation happening on whether India could actually become an export and chips manufacturing hub. Time is to say, but there is one place where India might make a dent is a lot of the new industry, the new economy industry, like renewables, the solar panels and the whole photovoltaic, the the electric vehicles, the green hydrogen, where these are areas which are pretty greenfield, and there's a huge amount of scope in India to do, and there's a significant of private and public money, including loans from the World Bank, are getting into these sectors. So India is basically hoping what the Chinese did when the rest of the world were figuring out what to do. China put this massive amount of capital in some of those sectors and got a first mover advantage. So Indians are hoping that something of that kind would happen with the new economy. These are highly risky gamble because you are this is a labor intensive country, capital is scarce, you're putting a lot of capital into this, so there's a lot of critics to that. But as economist who is pragmatist, we do look at some of those things to see, and my kind of bottom line view is that while there is incremental success, there's also a lot of failures. You don't hear about the failures as much as you hear the success. But it's nevertheless worth trying, because remember, they're not doing it at the cost of fiscally, moving to unsustainable fiscal policy. They're not doing it. So you keep the macro fiscal stable, and then you have the flexibility to play around. So a lot of the investment that are happening because they've improved the efficiency of the public management system. There's less leakages. So in a sense, you cannot completely, dismiss this model. But obviously, you want to be more critical and cautious to see where this is going and whether India would actually be able to work on the path of some of the East Asian countries with a very highly risk and heterodox approach to development.
Thank you, Deepak. Ahmad, why hasn't Bangladesh diversified sufficiently?
Right. So initially, I think about 10 years ago, Shanta may remember, we were both attending an upstream review of the World Development Report on Jobs by Martin Rama, and there a visiting Japanese researcher insisted that Bangladesh was a more East Asian economy than the South Asian economy. In that meeting, I was representing the East Asia region, so I kept my mouth. Actually, he was right. So 10, 12, 15 years ago, we had many of the characteristics that Murtaza was mentioning. We have high savings and investment rates, domestic rates. We'd invested significantly in human capital, rural infrastructure. So we have a very open economy, getting about $70-80 billion of exports and remittances, more for exports, if you will. So number of things were going in the right direction. But then, as I like to half joke, we started importing very bad economic policies from India, last government, which meant that you start protecting significant parts of your industry and try to grow those industries, which meant providing a lot of subsidies for production, which were not necessary in the first place, and instead lose your capital in human capital development and other things. So what has happened is we have diversified our manufacturing. Bangladesh now makes about 1,400 items which are exported in small amounts here and there. About 400-500 items are actually competitive items. However, we are now, aside from the ready-made garments sector, we are operating under high tariff walls, supplementary walls, and so on. So we have all kind of industries which have gone up: electronics industry, this industry, that industry, small computers. They're all with under high tariff rates which are not competitive. And then what we have done is very deliberate. Somehow we seem to have very deliberately, actually it's related. We have kept FDI away because our manufacturers are making huge amount of profits behind these high walls of protection. They don't want foreign investors to come in and take part of that. What they don't realize is there's no way Bangladesh can grow without getting the scale of the global supply chains. And for that, we need FDI. Samsung was extremely interested in Bangladesh around 2009 and 10. They were choosing between Vietnam and Bangladesh, or jointly both. Bangladesh did not prove receptive. Even now, I know Chinese investors are interested, but some of them who are there who want to go away to Mexico because the investment climate, the import regime, and everything makes the whole environment unfriendly for foreign investors. So that is how, if you will, we withdrew. And as Shanta was saying, we also withdrew from export GDP ratio of 20% to something like 11-10%. I mean,
Deepak, a quick question. Last I saw the numbers, FDI into India wasn't as impressive as I thought it would be. Has that changed?
No, actually, FDI has declined in the last 2 years. So there's a bit of a blip in during the post-COVID period when some of the large Indian businesses were trying to deleverage, and so they sold a lot of their assets to foreign players. So there's a massive investment: Google, Meta, Aramco, and others, which are big tag FDI. So it did look like India is getting into 100 billion, but then it has fallen. And I think what you see is today is the fundamental kind of the line where Indian in FDI should be lying, because as you know, that Indian domestic investors are also not investing a lot. That the total investment, private investment, is pretty flat. So you can't expect foreigners to put in a lot of money if the domestic investors are not doing it. So there are huge structural issues, no doubt, on this. But I think I just wanted to just add one point that today industrial policy in India is, one can say that it's the same old, import substitution story you are trying to do, with one big difference, which is what I think when Ahmad was saying, it struck to me that Indians have actually been encouraging foreign players to come in a lot. So every sector they're putting money on, the production link incentive, they're trying to attract the foreign firms to be the anchor for the sector. So whether it's Apple or Samsung or Dell or Lenovo, they're really trying very hard, or IBM, to come and I think that's the saving grace, that they won't come in and produce shoddy product in India for the Indian market because they have a global reputation to protect, and they're also going to export the same thing. And so that's the one important twist to the old industrial policy that I thought I should flag. Thank you.
Thank you. Hadia, while we talked about the big macro stories, these vulnerabilities and how we manage these vulnerabilities has an impact on welfare of the average citizen. What is your assessment of how a Pakistani citizen has coped with this macro uncertainty that we've gone through for the last 20 years? These boom and bust cycles. How is the average citizen coped with this?
आसान सा सवाल दिया है आपने. So we did some work with the Pakistan Labor Force surveys of the last 30 years, and we looked at so what are the responsiveness of women's labor market? How responsive is women's labor to these shocks and these busts? And our women's labor is highly responsive. So anytime there's a contraction, they tend to exit the labor market. They are the first to be laid off. What's really interesting is that in the last 2-3 years, we've heard anecdotally that there's a lot of women entering the labor market. And that is what the responsiveness also tends to suggest, that anytime there's an inflationary pressure as far as households are concerned, it's the women who will enter, and they'll go into these they'll come in as secondary earners. Now, what that suggests is two things. One, that as far as women's responsiveness to shocks is concerned, or as far as their career trajectories are concerned, we were talking about the Bangladesh experience and how high their female labor force participation is. The Pakistani women's labor force participation she's not thinking of her labor as a career. So it's not that she's going to have this 20-year trajectory in her mind or a 25-year trajectory in her mind as far as her work is concerned. She'll enter and exit the labor market depending on what the household condition looks like. And what that means is that given the pressures of the last couple of years, a lot of women have entered the labor market. Now, what are the kind of jobs that they have access to? They're going to have access to jobs that are not going to be that high value added, which means the amount of income that they're going to earn is going to be very low. So it really makes you think about how these households are faring. So now, yes, there's another earner in there, but this woman is going to be quite time poor. So her welfare is going to go down. The pressure on the household is perhaps not going to be released in the way that you've also mentioned, as far as, so we're seeing those pressures at the macroeconomic level, and you're going to see those pressures sort of reflected at the micro level as well. What's interesting is what's happened in the digital market, or what's interesting is what's happened in the informal market. And this is not just the informal market, even the formal small scale and medium enterprises. You're seeing a lot of movement there, a lot of mobility there, but you're again looking at low value added types of work taking place, which from the broader scheme of things, when you look at consumption patterns or when you look at investment patterns, we're not seeing those improvements which we think that in the long run is going to take us towards those high growth patterns, because the kind of jobs being created are those low value added types of jobs. And I mean, the plus side, I think, is that there's a lot of work which shows that as women start entering the labor market, your social norms tend to evolve, and that makes society a lot more accepting to women in the public space. So previous work that has been done in Pakistan has shown that with a 5-year lag, as women enter the labor market, you see norms become much more conducive to women being in the public space. But the negative side, as far as I'm concerned, is that the nature of work that women are doing is really not what we want to see happen in the long run for our economy. We really want to see women involved in much more high value added, because that has a real potential of taking these households out of cycles of poverty. Which yesterday's World Bank analysis shows we're not seeing that long run changes in spatial inequality and the kind of development that is taking place in our economy that tells us that yes, in the long run, we're going to see very high levels of human capital development or high levels of human capital outcomes. So, I mean, a bit positive, a bit negative as far as welfare impacts are concerned. And I think it goes back to the structure of the economy in terms of perhaps the social norms that exist and the way I always go back to the gender order as well.
Thank you. Since we have both Shanta and Deepak with us, and they both know Pakistan economy quite well, and we have Murtaza and Ahmad. Here's some evidence that we have gathered from the labor force survey of Pakistan. I have maintained, just as you said, that the biggest cost of these boom and bust cycles, IMF program, demand contraction, exchange rate adjustments is inflation. And the cost of inflation is largely borne by people who don't have assets. So I started to look at labor force survey data to look for evidence to support this. Now, labor force survey gives information on formal sector workers, not informal sector. So we don't know what's happening in the informal sector. But the labor force survey gives you by detailed skill categories, number of people employed, and nominal wages. So we took the index of nominal wages starting 2000 and went up to 21, 22, which is when the data were available. And we found that the index of nominal wages was much higher than the CPI index. So the real wages of workers in all of this period seem to be increasing in the formal sector. So I started to look for explanations. The only explanation that I found so far which seems to make sense, is in the remittances literature, where they say that as you lose people in skilled categories, you will observe the supply curve to shift upwards, so that those who stay behind will work for higher wages. Employers will want to retain them by paying higher wages. So when you throw in the remittances story, then you've got to look at the impact of IMF program on workers by differentiating those who have access to remittances and those who don't. And I think this may be happening to the structure of the economy. We may have a dual economy in terms of those households that benefit from remittances down the line and those households who don't. This is a very early hypothesis. We need much more work before we formalize anything on that. But I want to come back to short-term vulnerability as the final round, and then we'll take questions. You have written about the need for debt restructuring. Asim Hussain, your contemporary at the IMF, he's just yesterday in Project Syndicate, he has an article in which he argues against debt restructuring. And the argument is that most of the debt is owed to, this is in the context of Pakistan, most of the debt is concessionary debt, and it is often rolled over. He's arguing that rollover is not the answer, that additional loans are the answer. You have argued completely the opposite side. Do you want to say something about it?
Sure. Thank you, Ijaz. I think Asim is an old colleague and someone whose views should also be taken very seriously. I think it is true that the structure of Pakistan's debt is complicated, doesn't quite lend itself to the most elegant forms of debt restructuring that you could come up with. Typically, if you have most of your debt to private sector holders, it's a little easier to do a restructuring. In Pakistan's case, we owe about 40% of our debt to multilaterals. So World Bank, ADB, IMF. We owe about 10% of our debt, a little bit over than 10% to the Paris Club, which are also official creditors. We owe about 30% of our debt to China, including sort of commercial China. And very little of our debt is actually held by the private sector or by bondholders. And as I said, typically, if you had a larger share of your debt being held by bondholders, it's a little bit easier to impose costs on them. My contention, though, is that while it is true that most of our debt is what you would call concessionary, I think the burden of it has become too high for Pakistan. Just to illustrate, we spend, and I'm only talking about interest repayments now, not talking about principal repayments, but we spend 60% of our government revenues now on interest payments. We spend twice as much on interest payments as we do on health expenditure. 6 times as much as we do on education, 2.5 times as much as we do on public investment. So it's beginning to have serious consequences in terms of fiscal space, our ability to meet our development needs. How do you deal with a situation like this if you don't restructure your debt? You have to consolidate fiscally. That is what the IMF is asking us to do, to run a fiscal surplus, a primary surplus, into the indefinite future. That has its own consequences for the economy. My contention is that we have reached a point now where I think the balance now favors going for some kind of debt restructuring. You could also call it debt rescheduling, which is a slightly more polite term, where you get your maturities extended, you get things rolled over. I'm agnostic as to which of the two we need, but we do need something a little bit more forceful than an annual rollover exercise where we have to beg our creditors to give us one more year. I think that really gets in the way. So we need fiscal space. I think the way we can get it is by asking our creditors, including the multilaterals, by the way. I think it's a myth that multilaterals don't engage in some kind of debt operation. What they typically do is they roll over the debt that's coming due to them, and then they refinance it at a lower interest rate. So my contention is that we need to get over this irrational fear that we have of debt rescheduling. I think a lot of countries in Pakistan is not the only country I think that this applies to. I think there's about 60 countries perhaps globally that need some kind of debt operation. But I think what is holding us back are some taboos in the international debt architecture. One is your own fear of doing something like this. You fear that markets will impose a very big penalty on you. They will never forget. I think there are instances which we can point to recently in recent history where markets have given you actually the benefit of a rescheduling because it's increased your fiscal space, it's made your economy more sustainable. The other fear I think that typically gets in the way is of these new creditors. What do you do with China? What do you do with Saudi Arabia? What do you do with the Gulf states? I think there too, the debt architecture globally needs to evolve to give these players a little bit more of, a voice, like the old Paris Club used to have. You have to let these people, these new creditors in, and you have to give them some of the same privileges that you used to give to the Paris Club. For example, in the Paris Club, if the majority creditor agrees to give a rescheduling on its debt to a particular country, it can force the other creditors to at least accept similar terms. We don't do that with China. We don't do that with Saudi Arabia. We don't do that with the Gulf. And finally, I think on the IMF side, which is the global arbiter of whether your debt is sustainable or not, I think there's a lot of scope for using its own tools better. I think its own tools in the case of Pakistan, to me, are flashing red, but the staff judgment somehow overrides them. And I think that just continues to keep Pakistan trapped in this sort of vicious debt cycle and doesn't give us the room that we need to start investing and really beginning to grow. So that's my view. I know Ahsan has I think his view is not that different from mine. Actually, I think it might be more of the terminology thing. But I think he will also accept that Pakistan needs fiscal space. And this level of fiscal austerity that the IMF is demanding of us is probably not going to end well.
No, he speaks of fiscal space, all right, but he speaks of fiscal space in terms not so of rollover, because that just postpones the problem, but he speaks of it in terms of fresh loans on good terms. That's the line he takes. But Shanta, Sri Lanka has had to grapple with these issues. What's your view on debt restructuring?
Well, we just completed the debt restructuring on Friday of last week. So I agree with Murtaza. I think the debt restructuring, despite all the complications he outlined, is actually not just desirable, but necessary. And I think it took us 2.5 years to get to this point. So it's not going to be easy. And in Sri Lanka's case, since we were in default, we had no other option. But I think there are some favorable components to it. One is we were able to pass a flexible inflation targeting act, or a central bank act that preserves the independence of the central bank, which was something that people have been trying to do for a long time. But it's the fact that it increased the credibility of Sri Lanka's monetary policy in the eyes of the private creditors, and they said it, actually benefited us. But let me just also add that we've introduced a couple of new instruments in the debt restructuring. I don't know whether you've seen the Financial Times articles on this, but Sri Lanka introduced, and I confess I had something to do with it, to introduce something called a governance-linked bond as part of the debt restructuring. And these are it's about $1 billion of bonds where there are certain criteria on governance, on good governance. If the country meets those criteria, the coupon rate goes down by about 75 basis points. And so this is, given, as I was saying earlier, and several others have been saying, that it was these governance failures that got us into this mess. We've now created an instrument that is in the government's fiscal interests to introduce the governance reforms. And that actually might help the president win over some of his cabinet colleagues, because we have the similar problems that all these other countries have of people who cabinet members who want to just spend money. But here you can actually say that if we do introduce some of these governance reforms, and by the way, one of them is the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So that is a way of reinforcing the Fiscal Responsibility Act. we can not only save money, but actually improve the management of the economy. So I'm now that it's over, I am somewhat bullish on debt restructuring. But I also I'm not naive enough to say that it's going to be easy. And the point that Murtaza mentioned about China is significant. And I think the real point there was to recognize, at least in Sri Lanka's case, China was the largest official creditor. So the Paris Club was actually a smaller player, and the only Paris Club member who was significant was Japan. And so the idea that we should do the debt restructuring by following the Paris Club and then expect China to follow suit was ridiculous to begin with. And the Chinese made that point several times. And so we just flipped it the other way and sort of you work with China on a debt restructuring and then try to make it consistent with the Paris Club.
Okay, great. Ahmad, do you want to say something about the debt issue in Bangladesh?
Before that, just quickly, I mean, the issue of vulnerability and jobs is, that's extremely important. Lost by those who advocate import substitution. They forget the whole by economic textbooks, Salper Samuelson, but in reality also, when you go for a closed economy type thing, you go for more capital intensive investments, you start losing jobs, and that has been happening in Bangladesh for the last 7-8 years. Job growth has significantly slowed down. Real wages have slid to negative. I'm very surprised the Pakistan Labour Force Survey does not include the informal sector. That's, to me, scandalous. I've worked on India, I've worked on Bangladesh. I'm a bit surprised. So generally, this is a very elitist approach. The closed economy approach, what people don't realize, is actually, in the name of nationalism and so on, a very elitist approach. And people suffer from that. I just wanted to make the point. In Bangladesh, debt in headline numbers is manageable, 38%. It increased by $40 billion. Private sector debt, I'm talking about the last 7-8 years. Private sector debt has also increased by about $10 billion to $17 billion. Some of this may be publicly guaranteed. It's not very clear. But the composition will create problems in the next few years. Amortization will triple, roughly from, I think, 7 to 20, 3 times. It'll go up 3 times. I mean, about $2-3 billion will be added to amortization. So again, that brings us to the point of fiscal space, as Murtaza was speaking. So although we have, low debt, the fiscal space is a problem. Interest share of the fiscal spaces keeps on going up, and then we will have this amortization demands. So we are in for a bumpy ride, not as serious as the other countries, but we also have it.
Thank you. Deepak, a word from you. India doesn't face a debt problem, but
so I don't think there's a national issue, but at a sub-national level, there are severe debt problems, including Punjab, the state that you and we worked on, the India Punjab. Some of the Indian states are in an unsustainable debt path. But I want to just leave with 3 points on the kind of bigger structural and the labor force survey. I think first is India doesn't have a jobs problem, unlike a lot of people talk about it. But if you look at the PLFS periodic labor force survey, which comes out every quarter, India doesn't have a jobs problem, but India has a problem of structural stagnation of the economy. So Indian economy has not really gone into some of these new sectors, and the economy hasn't really transformed in the way structurally. So actually, after COVID, there are more people working in agriculture now than they were 5 years ago. So you have regressed from structurally. So there are numerous Indians who are stuck in very low pay, low productivity jobs. And that's the real problem in India, not jobs, but productivity. Second is there's a very interesting thing happening on the labor market, which is dramatic feminization of the labor market in a positive way. India used to be known for this secular decline in the labor force participation rate, which had come down, below Pakistan and below Saudi Arabia and many of the countries with, low labor force participation for women. This has reversed in the last 10 years. So now it's close to 40%, which is pretty significantly better, though there's a lot more to go. And there is this dramatic, because a lot of women are now educated and they want to work. And once they're in the labor market, they're not retreating back. So that's a very positive development that has happened. Third is that Indian economy, at least the policymakers, are trying very hard to formalize the Indian economy. So this informal sector, they want to shrink the informal, get everyone to formal. Part of this is a very good thing in the long run, but this is creating a lot of distress. The MSMEs are in trouble, low-income households are in trouble. This is also widening inequality, but the government is very determined to basically formalize the informal sector. It's again one of those gambits that Modi government has done, which certainly will help in the long run, but will create a lot of distress in the middle. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much, Ijaz. And I'll state in the end if there's any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deepak. Okay, time for some questions. So I'll take 3 and get them to answer, and then we can take some more.
Yeah, thank you. Very insightful, Imran Zia from SERP. I'll just read a news that I looked at yesterday, and I would like Murtaza Saab and Ms. Hadia to maybe comment on this. So this says $300 million ADB loan secured to strengthen social protection. How long can we keep doing it? Is it a good idea? Bad idea? Maybe 300 is okay, but 600 is not. What's the limit? That's the first question. And the second is the frequency. I mean, where do we go? I mean, every 3 months there is a new item like that. 1 billion from World Bank, 300 million from ADB. How long can we sustain this? And how does this play into this does not increase productivity. How do you as an economist look at it? And what should be the policy choice?
3 first? Yes. Let me come back to you. Anjum?
I want to understand the debt that Pakistan's got as part of CPEC and the power projects set up under CPEC. So a substantial component of the investment is debt. And I was wondering if the debt numbers that were mentioned includes that component. And from newspaper reports, at least Pakistan has been trying to renegotiate this debt for the power plants with China. So it's starting with China to negotiate its debt and has made very little success on that. So it's arm twisting a lot of investors, the local investors in the power sector, but those who have come under the CPEC project have not been able to give any concessions so far. So any comments on that?
Another question right there.
Hi, thank you for that. Just very briefly to hear from Murtaza, but also if other Pakistani panelists could comment, that you mentioned in the past 15 years you've been to IMF for at least 25 times, and in 2005 and 6 we saw that there's hope. I just wonder if you could comment on the political regimes and the political instability, whether that has kind of any relationship to the economy and the performance of the country based on that hybrid regime and militarization. Thank you.
Okay, so let's respond to these 3. I think they were addressed. All 3 were sort of addressed to you, and Hadia's. You and Hadia. So why don't you?
So, आपका जो सवाल था about the ADB $300 million that has been received for social protection. I mean, in principle, you're right that what we really need is a much more systematic analysis of what it is, how much do we need, and what are we going to use it for. So for me, the concern is not how much we're getting, but the concern is how are we using it, who are we giving it to, is it getting to the marginalized, is it getting to the vulnerable or not. So jitna bhi mil jaye, agar 15 million bhi milta hai, so I mean, even if you get a tenth of what is being given to us, if it's being used to really help the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, then I think that's money well spent. But I take your broader point, which I think comes back to what Dr. Murtaza was also saying, which is that We keep getting these bilateral loans, multilateral loans, and then we keep going back for restructuring because it's the structure of the economy that is the real issue. So, what are you using these roles, these this debt that we're taking in? What are we using it for? If we're using it to expand the economy, if we're using it to invest it, if we're using it to grow our exports, then theek hai. But if we're not, then that's where we really get stuck as far as this taking on debt is concerned.
Really don't have much to add. I think Hadia covered it quite well, but I would just say that one of the tragedies that happens when you're in an IMF program is that it becomes largely an accounting exercise. So what the IMF tells you is that you have an external financing gap, which means that when they project what your current account deficit is going to be over the next 2-3 years, and they add what debt amortization you will have coming due, they come up with what your gap is. They identify what the resources are. So the IMF would be very happy actually if we were to take this loan, because it would be one way of filling that gap. And it's also typically at a concessional rate, and so they have no problem with it. But I totally agree with you that we need to very carefully assess what the debt is for, how much is enough, how much of it is actually not even going to come to Pakistan. We know how these things work. A lot of the expenses sometimes just occur sort of outside Pakistan because there are consultant fees and everything attached to these debts. So we do definitely need to assess the debt that we take on much more carefully than we are doing right now. In an IMF program, it becomes largely an accounting exercise, and therefore almost any source of finance that's coming in is okay. There was a little bit of a controversy, you remember earlier on, about a debt we took on with some commercial bank that was taken on at a very exorbitant rate. The Ministry of Finance had to come in and say, no, we're not taking it. But this is what starts to happen when you go to the IMF so many times. You basically end up becoming almost an accounting thing, and the larger effects on the economy, the growth, so debt sustainability, that sometimes goes into the background. Sir, on your question, and Saab, on the numbers that I quoted do include the CPEC debt as well. So 30% of our debt being owed to China, including both official and commercial, does include CPEC. The problem that you are pointing out about not having much success when we do this bilaterally is a classic problem you have when you're trying to reschedule your debt. No one creditor will want to give you any concessions because they will want you to also talk to your other creditors as well. Why should they give you some concession? You will use the resources that you have saved to pay somebody else. So there's a classic coordination problem that does happen. And in the end, you do end up squeezing sometimes those that you feel that you can squeeze the easiest. For example, your domestic investors in the case of the IPP projects that you were talking about. But this is what makes debt restructuring quite complicated. This is why it takes 2.5 years, as Shanta was saying, because getting everybody to agree is complicated. And therefore, sometimes you can rely on your geopolitical friends. That's why we talk to the Chinese first, because we seem to believe that maybe they can give us some concession that is, can be kept a little bit under the carpet or done in certain ways. So, but it is a problem. I mean, this is an issue that you have with debt rescheduling, that you can't get everybody to coordinate, and you do need some kind of coordination. In the past, the Paris Club used to be able to do that because the Paris Club was typically the most sort of important debtor in any country, but now the debt landscape has become quite diversified and it's creating problems. On your question about political instability, I'm not a political expert, but look, anything that leads to macro instability does hurt your economy because it makes investors very nervous, both domestic and external. It makes it harder to plan for the future. It introduces volatility in the economy, in the exchange rate and inflation. You don't quite know where reforms are going to go when you have political governments changing all the time. So for sure, I think if we had a system where political transition was a little bit more predictable and it was not quite as contested as it is in our country, that would help macroeconomic policy continuity, which ultimately is what I can comment on. But the experience from sort of other countries is certainly that without macroeconomic stability, you can never really get durable growth. And macroeconomic stability is linked to political cycles and political change and how you go from one regime to another regime. So that's what I'll say on that.
Shanta, you've thought a lot about social protection. What do you think about ADB loan in a fairly stressful time for Pakistan, which is used for social protection, at least the way it's done in Pakistan, which is that you deliver cash to the poorest households. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Thank you. I did want to comment, even though the question was addressed at the two Pakistanis, because there was a statement saying that, well, what's the point of this? It's not productive. On the contrary, social protection expenditures. Now, leave aside the fact that it's an ADB loan. Just social protection expenditures can be extraordinarily productive, and it's for two reasons. One is that they help poor households cushion themselves from shocks. You have a flood or an earthquake or something, and where people are really in desperate straits. And if you can provide cash to them very quickly, as I recall, Deepak and I and a few others were doing in the Pakistan earthquake of 2005, you can actually improve their livelihoods. They actually can be very productive. I mean, it's been shown that these are super productive expenditures. And I think the experience in Pakistan, the Benazir Bhutto program and things like that, are ones that show that you can actually make cash transfers work. Now, let me add one other aspect, one other way in which social protection is productive, which is not often recognized, that it permits you to get rid of unproductive fuel subsidies. All of our countries have this phenomenon of ridiculous fuel subsidies, which are basically a transfer to the rich, because they're the ones who consume more fuel and electricity and so on. But whenever you try to reform fuel subsidies, as I have tried in several places, the resistance is, well, it's going to hurt the poor, even though what it's really going to do is to hurt the upper classes. Now, if you have a well-functioning social protection program, you can actually say, no, we are going to accompany that subsidy reform with increased cash transfers to the poor, targeted to the poor. So we take a program that is targeted to the rich and convert it into a program that's targeted to the poor. Plus, you get the productivity gains of removing fuel subsidies. And that can be enormously productive for you in the medium term.
Thank you, Chantal. Maruf.
So we've been talking about the architecture of the economy is broken, and we seem to be in a vicious cycle, right? And I'd like you to sort of think about, it's not just that we're financing this insatiable appetite for fiscal federal fiscal needs through external debt, but also domestic debt, right? Which is having a crowding out effect on private sector investments and whatnot. But the question is really focused on, Murtaza and Hadia, but also maybe learning a little bit from Deepak from early 90s in India. What should the sequencing look like as we come out of it? I mean, it seems like, the first step is debt restructuring, but what comes after that? And how should we think about sequencing? Obviously we have rentier economy, there's lots of issues, and you're right, we need bold structural reforms, but I'd like the panel to talk about sequencing.
Who wants to go first? Oh, okay, let me take two more questions. Yes.
My name is Sarah. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes.
So I want the panel's comment on from what I'm seeing. I mean, debt is a consequence of misgovernance. For instance, if you say that we owe 40% to multinationals, laterals, and then we're also saying that we have had several human development, for instance, projects, fertility, education, literacy projects, and then we have a lot of debt for them now, but we don't know, do we have the impact evaluations? Did we know if these projects did well? So is the question then, the people who give you loans are not implementers. We are supposed to do it. So is it a governance issue? The problem is the debt, or the way we 2.2 million kids are still out of school in Pakistan. So is this a problem of World Bank, ADB, or is this something that we as a country did not do?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, debt in itself is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it. Yes, Ghazal.
So it's become pretty evident from everyone's conversations that Pakistan really does need a major restructuring of its economy and in terms of its models and all. But being a politician and looking at it from that side, I don't think we're going to do it willingly. Just to give a short story over here, we were in a cabinet meeting and the finance minister said we only have 50 billion after the current side is done for any kind of development spending. And this is in a province. The cabinet was like, that's not acceptable. We need at least 300 billion. And he said, that's not possible without moving the current side. A week later, he comes back and he's like, okay, congratulations. We have the 300 billion that you needed. And so that's how it's done over here. So maybe a few
Ghazan is
people-
talking about the KP government.
KP government.
Yes.
And so there are a few people within government who understand this kind of feel that maybe the way to go and have these reforms and structural reforms is to default and force the issue, because if we're still breathing somehow or the other, we'll continue to roll this over and it's eventually going to maybe make it worse. So Sri Lanka has been through that experience. Other countries like Argentina are coming out of it. Is after going through that, is that the answer, or does that somehow even just make it worse and those structural reforms still don't happen?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions. Yeah, let me take one more. Sajid.
Yeah, so when it comes to the structure of the economy, I think gender is an issue that you can't ignore, right? For India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, female labor force participation is close to 40% or thereabout. Pakistan is around 25%. So I want to get takes from the foreign members of the panel about how the other South Asian economies managed to sort of transition away, like raise their female labor force participation. And then I also want to learn from Dr. Hadia Majid about why we're still sort of stagnating in terms of not being able to improve our female labor force participation.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we can start with Hadia. But Hadia, comment on one thing. I mean, until recently, I was looking at, maybe Deepak, you can also clarify. Until recently, I was looking at female labor force participation rates, and Pakistan and India weren't too far apart. Bangladesh was substantially higher, and of course, Sri Lanka considerably higher. So I heard you say take a higher female labor participation rate, and Sajid has also mentioned that number. So I don't know what has happened in the last year or so for the numbers to change so much.
Yeah, I don't know that high number. So I will so I agree with you in the debt is, I don't think debt is necessarily a sign of misgovernance. I mean, nations take on debt all the time because you're borrowing against your future. And the reason why people give you debt is because they believe when you say that, we're going to use this debt well. Our problem is that we have consistently shown that we are not using that debt well, and we're not investing it in the way that we should. At least that's my take on it. I don't know if our gender labor force ratios are as low as they are. In fact, they're not. Going back to what you said, we just don't do a good enough job of meeting an informal, sort of figuring out what is the labor force participation rate in the informal sector. To me, a greater concern is that even when women are working, what is the type of work that they are doing? So a lot of times women don't even recognize the work that they're doing because it's such a big extension of their care roles that they're not going out of the house. We're not seeing what we see in the Bangladesh case, which is that women are going to the factory and then coming back to the house. We're not seeing your educated women in the we have a labor force participation rate of women with tertiary education of 32%. So where are all of our educated women? Why aren't they a part of the labor force? That's of bigger concern to me. And if they are a part of the labor force, what are the kind of what is the nature of the work that they're doing? Do they have autonomy over their finances or not? In that, I think the rest of the South Asian region is doing much better. And here, there's one example. I traveled to Nepal a few years ago, and there was something odd about what I was seeing, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I realized it's because there were so many women sitting inside the store. All of the women were part of the labor force, sitting inside the stores, which we don't see. So I'm more concerned about what is the work that they're doing. And I think we're just not doing a good enough job of measuring it. And even when we're measuring it, it's not the work that we think of as empowering work. So that's all I'll say on that.
Deepak, the numbers.
I had a question for Deepak. Yeah, so
Let him answer this.
so there has been so India used to do this household survey and unemployment survey, which have stopped in 2017 or 16. And they came up with a new set of survey, which is called periodic labor force survey, which is quarterly for urban and annual for the whole country. There are lots of issues when this labor force survey came about. A lot of people were skeptical. Of course, the current government, many intellectuals don't like the government. So there's been a bit of a pushback saying this is not the right, this is not a credible survey. But we have worked with the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and we have looked at this data very, very carefully, and we produce a quarterly report called India Jobs and Occupation Tracker. Using this data, we feel these are fairly credible numbers, and the growth versus the change in employment versus the change in quarterly growth rate are very tightly correlated. So you do see that there's no reason to be. So when COVID hit, participation fell by 20%. After COVID, it went up. So there is a fairly robust set of numbers, but there's a lot of skepticism to this data. So sometimes World Bank and others don't use this data. And so if you use the older data, then obviously you'll not see this increase. But if you look at the periodic labor force survey, starting in 2018 till 2024, you do see this dramatic acceleration in women in gender participation rate. And I just don't use the macro data. I also come from a parts of, in rural parts of India, so I travel a lot. And what we see on the ground are actually significant improvement in labor force participation. We can talk about what's the reason for it. But I want to just answer two questions that was asked. One was the sequence of reforms. I think, as economists, we do take very cautious view about what's the binding constraint. We should relax that, move on to this. But, the real world is much more complicated. So if you do reform by stealth, take your opportunity, whatever you can do, I think is still a better way than trying to find out the best sequence to do it. So in a sense, many countries reform under duress during crisis. Sri Lanka is doing a lot of cleaning up when they're in trouble. So is Bangladesh. So I think that it's okay to do that and not try to be very cautious about it. I think the second strategy I would suggest is, which what a lot of East Asian countries do, they do external commitment in some of the tie your hands by saying, I'm going to liberalize the economy, I'm going to sign to RCEP, I'm going to do this, that, XYZ on trade, investment, this. And then you force your domestic lobby to come and, say, I have committed, now we have to do it. We have to open up the economy in 5 years. So you use external commitment as a disciplining device to do domestic reform. And obviously, the sequence might fall in the sense that first you do external commitment, and then you do domestic reform. That's another strategy I would suggest. Third is, I feel like, when you have debates on reforms, and there's a lot about, whether this is growth enhancing, will this reduce poverty, will this increase inequality? I think growth enhancing reforms are super important in countries like ours, which are relatively poor. So anything that would enhance growth should take precedence. Of course, you want to make sure that this doesn't create massive amount of inequality and all that stuff. But I would focus very much on those kind of reforms. The second question was on labor force participation. Why has there been a huge increase? Frankly, there's a lot of studies on this. Some of the structural issues are still there in India. So we don't see this dramatic acceleration. We see incremental changes every quarter. It's happening more in urban areas than rural areas. But one of the things that has happened is there's a lot more women participation in agriculture. And that's people think that's a distressed jobs because the men have after COVID have migrated out, and so the women have actually had to step into agriculture jobs and all. So these jobs, I mean, so the hypothesis is once the economy is back in track, things become more prosperous, people will withdraw. Something that Hadia was mentioning in Pakistan context might happen. I don't believe that. I feel when we go and talk to people and all, once you have women going out and working, the consumption pattern changes. Two income households have much more consumer goods. So there is a whole consumerism that starts kicking in once the women starts working, and it's very hard to change your behavior and pull women back from the workforce. So we feel this is a more durable change. One of the big things that has happened is there's been this huge commitment by political leaders. As you saw, India's recently passed a law to reserve 30% of the parliament seats. There's a lot of awareness in G20. India put women-led development as a priority, and I was pretty surprised because I thought this is one area where you're lagging behind. Why did you put it out as your thing? But that was deliberate to kind of push some of this external, use external commitment to drive home domestic reforms. So I think it's this big push awareness and the fact that so many women in the education, there's now almost parity. So many women and girls are now studying. It's very hard to pull them back out and say, you go and study, and then you can't work. So those kind of factors have played in, but it's still a huge, it's just an incremental progress. There's a lot more to be done. So I don't think we should be taking credit for this yet.
Okay. Thank you, Deepak. I think you answered the sequencing question very well. I think we should now bring it to a close. We are 50 minutes past the time. I just want to end, Shanta, by saying that I hope 10 years from now, not 18, but 10 years from now, we'll do another South Asia paper where we will remove the question mark. Shanta, you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking as well. I think.
Great. And because look, Pakistan is the laggard here, and our historical record is pretty good. There's no reason why we cannot again be doing well. We know what the problems are. We know what the solutions are. It's just a question of getting the right structures in place so that we take decisions and follow through on them. So I despite all the doom and gloom, I remain quite optimistic. Thank you very much.